Everyone, and welcome to the evening meeting of August the 23rd, our regular council meeting. The meeting is being recorded live and is streaming. All representations to council, written and verbal, will form part of the public record and be available to the public for viewing electronically or as a written record. Members of the public may access the meeting or participate in the following ways. Watch the meeting live or recorded at the District of Summerland YouTube channel, youtube.com, District of Summerland. And you can request to speak during the meeting if you haven't registered in advance. And speaking during one of the two public comment opportunities, just call the meeting conference line at 778-907-2071. Enter meeting ID 506-489-9374 and passcode code 485186. After I have provided everyone who has pre-registered with an opportunity to comment, the floor will be open to those on the conference line. Corporate Officer, do we have any late items to introduce?
Yes, there's one request for a late item titled Official Community Plan and Zoning Amendment Bylaw related to 2107 Tate Street be added to the agenda following item 9.3.
Thank you. And could I ask someone to bring forward adoption of the amended agenda, please? Councillor Holmes, Councillor Carlson, all in favor? Thank you. And to adopt the minutes of our August 9th regular evening council meeting. Councillor Van Elfen, Councillor Barkwell, all in favor? Thank you. On to my mayor's report. Just a short one tonight, another weekend of cooler weather and some precipitation. Some have lamented the end of hot days of summer, but perhaps this change in weather signals the end of the 2021 fire season. And the hundreds of British Columbians who have been under alert and order can experience some relief from this traumatic experience. On August the 20th, I attended the Summerland Community Arts Council board meeting. Discussions included the board's preferred name for the center, events that are being planned over the next several months, including Light Up the Arts, potentially, and the reopening of the renovated building. CAO Stat will be speaking more on the center reopening, and council will be discussing the naming of the center later this evening under item 13.1. I attended the most recent meeting of the Development Process Improvement Advisory Committee, which was held on August the 18th, and I'm looking forward to the district's Grasslands Weed Walk this Wednesday. The district is partnering with the Grassland Conservation Council of BC to co-host this event. Again, CAO Stat will speak more on this event during his CAO report. A reminder that Summerland is part of Interior Health is subject to the updated COVID-19 protocols announced last Friday. And of course, there were other restrictions brought in just today. Updates are available on both the district's webpage, although maybe not quite yet, and at interiorhealth.ca. Council will be virtually attending the annual Union of BC Municipalities Convention during the week beginning September the 13th. Because of this, there will only be one series of council meetings in September on the 27th. Even though the days are cooling off, September is a busy month for many Summerland folks. Crops continue to be harvested, students and educators head back to school. Both the Apple Valley Cruisers Show and Shine and the Summerland Fall Fair return after a year hiatus, fingers crossed, and the Friends of the Ornamental Gardens host their fall plant sale. I'd also like to wish everyone a happy Labor Day. And that's the end of my report. Over to you, CAO Stat.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm pleased to report that we have been successful in our grant application to the Economic Trust of Southern Interior, also known as ETSI, to fund our further analysis of the feasibility of the Okanagan Food and Innovation Hub. The Okanagan Food and Innovation Hub is a project that the district has been spearheading along with a multitude of other regional economic development organizations to create a food innovation hub for the region. This would allow for value-added processing of local foods, new food entrepreneurs to test products, food innovation and commercialization, and training and education to small-scale food producers and processors. This grant in the amount of nearly $38,000 will support a phasing of the business plan to start with a smaller scale model, the completion of an expression of interest process for a potential land and building partner, and council selection of the hub location. District staff will be working hard to action these activities over the next few months. We are nearing completion and final occupancy of the newly renovated and reinvigorated Arts and Cultural Center building. Painting is almost complete and final fixtures are being added to complete the building as we speak. The revamped Arts and Cultural Center will be a new community amenity in celebration of the arts and culture, and it supports and aligns with the district's cultural plan. The district has been partnering with the Summerland Arts Council on the design elements of the building, which includes the moving of the art gallery to the bottom floor to allow for a large multi-purpose room on the main floor for arts and culture programming and events. A grand opening will be scheduled soon to celebrate this important project. District of Summerland and the Grasslands Conservation Council of BC have partnered to host a grassland weed walk on Giants Head Mountain this Wednesday morning at 8:30 a.m. Participants will learn about the important role of healthy grasslands, the threat of weeds and how to control them, as well as information on the trails and redevelopment project. Hosts include the district staff, habitat biologists, representatives from the Grasslands Conservation Council, as well as our own Mayor Boot. Finally, I am glad to report that we have now completed the Peach Orchard Campground Court upgrades, which included court resurfacing and new fences on the existing multi-use courts to make 4 new pickleball courts for a total of 6 pickleball courts at this location now. The Summerland Pickleball Club contributed $5,000 to the project, which will support their growing membership, which now totals over 150. And with that, I conclude my report.
Thank you. Does council have any questions for Mr. Stad and his report? Okay, great. Now the first of our 2 public comment opportunities. Is there anyone that has indicated they'd like to speak?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So we have no registered members of the public requesting to speak, and I believe the people online are related to the development services items on the agenda.
Thank you. Is that Jim Baker? Yes, great, thank you. So on to the first of the development reports. 9.1 is the development variance permit for 2520 Landry Crescent, DVP 21-023.
Good evening, Council. So the district has received an application for variance at 2520 Landry Crescent. The proposal seeks to vary the minimum required rear setback to facilitate the construction of a new single detached home. The property is a vacant residential lot along Okanagan Lake in the Trout Creek neighborhood of Summerland. The applicant is proposing to build a new single detached home on the property while maintaining the riparian area. The applicants have a provincially approved riparian areas protection report that outlines a setback of 27 meters from the high water mark of Okanagan Lake. In the official community plan, the future land use designation of the subject property is low density residential, and it is zoned RSD1 residential medium lot. These land uses are consistent with neighboring properties. It should be noted that the property is located within a watercourse development permit area. As such, a referral was submitted to the Ministry of Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. A letter of correspondence was received from their staff stating that a Water Sustainability Act application would be required for any work in and about a stream. So this includes any use of equipment for storage of materials, landscaping, and erosion protection retaining walls. So the applicant has requested to vary section 10.1.6A2 of the zoning bylaw in order to reduce the minimum required rear yard setback from 6 meters to 3.75 meters. It should be noted that in accordance with the zoning bylaw, when a lot abuts both the street and the high water mark of a river or lake, the property line abutting the high water mark is considered the front property line. In this case, the property line abutting the street is considered the rear property line. The standard rear setback for RSD1 zoned lots is 7.5 meters. However, section 10.1.6A8 states that the minimum rear setback shall be 6 meters when the front property line abuts the high water mark of a lake. The applicants have requested a setback relaxation due to the limited available building area on the property. The property abuts Okanagan Lake and as such is affected by the Watercourse development permit area. The primary objective of this development permit area designation is to protect the riparian area habitat and to ensure that no harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of natural features, functions, and conditions that support fish life processes in the riparian assessment area occurs. In accordance with the district's official community plan, a watercourse development permit can only be issued following the receipt of an approved riparian assessment by the District of Summerland from the responsible provincial minister. Although the applicants have not yet submitted their watercourse development permit, they have completed the required wrapper report prepared by a qualified environmental professional and received approval by the province. As identified on the site plan, the riparian setback line is placed 27.4 meters precisely from the high water mark for Okanagan Lake. So the rear property line curves to the north as you go west on the lot, meaning that the western portion of the house technically needs to be pushed back compared to the eastern portion. The proposed rear setback of 3.75 meters would allow the home to be constructed in a uniform fashion. The proposed home design shows a modest build respectful of the riparian setback requirement. A significant portion of the home will also fully conform to the 6-meter setback requirement from the street, including the garage and driveway area. As seen on the site plan, only a small portion of the home and covered entry project into the setback. There will be no negative impacts to parking as the garage is adequately set back 6 meters from the road and 2 cars have adequate room to park in the driveway. The developable area on the property is restricted by the enhanced riparian setback of 27 meters. Allowing a small setback reduction on the street side will facilitate the construction of a new home and help protect the riparian environment adjacent to the lake. The watercourse development permit will be reviewed by staff and has received approval from the province supporting the proposed location of the new home and the riparian mitigation measures proposed by the applicant's qualified environmental professional. Staff are supportive of the variance as there should be no impact to neighboring properties or safety to the street. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Council, any questions of Alex? No, I have just one question. It's, I guess, related to process. Did we need to talk to the provincial staff about the watercourse development permit because it's in the riparian area next to the lake? Typically, we don't have to do that. Is that right? Or maybe I'm completely off.
So through the chair, are you, just to clarify the question, are you referring to the referral sent to the Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resource?
I'm not sure which ministry it was, but the ministry that came back with the approval after looking at the assessment. Is that Flynn Railroad that does that? Okay. Yeah, so that's my question. I'm just wondering if that had to be done because it was riparian area next to the lake, or is it always done for riparian watercourse development?
Yeah, so through the chair, the provincial approval is triggered by any watercourse development permit area around an identified stream or watercourse.
Thank you. And so I'm assuming then that once we get or now that you've got the provincial staff, assessment and referral back to us, then it's just the regular course where that is a permit that's issued by the District of Summerland? Yeah.
Yeah, so through the chair. So what will happen if this variance is granted? Essentially, the applicants will then provide staff with the approved report from the province, and we will do our thorough process of issuing a watercourse development permit with the approval from the province. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. Any other questions? Oh, Councillor Van Alphen.
Put the motion on the floor, Madam Mayor. Thank you. That council authorize issuance of development variance permit DVP 21-023 for property located at 2520 Landry Crescent, legally described as Lot 7, District Lot 508, a Soyuz Division Yale District Plan KAP 77427, and that a variance to the following sections of zoning bylaw 2000-450 be granted. Rear setback section 10.1.6A double I to vary rear setback from 6 meters to 3.7 meters proposed.
Thank you, Councillor Van Alphen. Seconder, Councillor Patton. Any further discussion on Councillor Barkwell?
Yeah, just a question to staff, if I could, Madam Mayor. The 3.75 meter setback line is drawn on the plan there, and it seems to me that the covered entry area extends beyond that 3.75 meter setback line. Is that not apply to covered areas? Because I remember we had to give like a 2-inch variance for a deck, and I wondered whether the covered entry would.
Yeah, so through the chair, porches are allowed to project into the setback so long as it's no more than 0.6 meters.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, anything else on this? I'll call the question. All in favor? And that is carried unanimously. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Very happy people there, and their dog, oh, look, dog. Okay, good night. All right, on to 9.2, short-term rentals. Wouldn't it be nice if everyone, yes. 9.2, short-term rentals, regulatory approach considerations. And this is Joanne.
Right, thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm sorry I didn't bring a dog for everybody's enjoyment. All right, so the purpose of this presentation is to present a plan for approaching short-term rentals for Summerland. So I'm going to start by providing a bit of background information, just to give an idea about the current status of short-term rentals in Summerland. And I'm going to review some key considerations and do a bit of comparison of other jurisdictions. And then I will conclude with a preferred approach as a starting point to address short-term rentals and move the project forward. So first, a bit of background. So what are short-term rentals? So online booking platforms such as Airbnb, VRBO, HomeAway, and countless others are commonly used to rent out a residential unit on a nightly or weekly basis to tourists. So this is different from a long-term stay over 28 days where there's a residential tenure. So short-term rentals are for rental periods that are generally less than 1 month in duration. They're also called vacation rentals or tourist accommodation, as they cater to the traveling public, not to full-time residents. So short-term rentals are a type of temporary accommodation catering to tourists, but they have no set definition in the district's zoning bylaw. That being said, we do have short-term rentals currently operating in Summerland. So it's estimated that there are 174 unique rental units currently being advertised across the dozens of booking platforms online. So this map shows the general location of properties currently listed for short-term rentals on websites owned by TripAdvisor, Priceline, Expedia, Airbnb, and others. So the red squares are rentals that are shown, they're advertised on Airbnb, and the blue diamonds are Expedia-owned platforms and rentals that are being advertised through those means. So the vast majority of these rentals are single-family homes. So 90% of the listings are for single-family homes where the entire home is rented out to one group at a time. Only 8% of the rental units are shared units where the guests share common areas with their host. So in Summerland, in general, there's limited tourist accommodation. So we have business licenses for 1 hotel, 3 motels, 5 campgrounds, and 22 bed and breakfasts. So I'm just going to give some context as to where tourist accommodation is currently allowed by briefly reviewing each of these categories. So with a bed and breakfast, they are allowed in agricultural, rural residential, and urban residential zones, which are shown on the map here. So these, you can see, are a large area of Summerland. So there's lots of physical area where you can have a bed and breakfast as a secondary use. So under the zoning bylaw, a bed and breakfast must be resident occupied. It also must be attached to or form part of the residence, and it can only be in a single detached house. So the main difference between a bed and breakfast and a short-term rental is that the resident is present during the guest stay, and rooms within the home are rented out to guests, but not the whole house. Bed and breakfasts are also limited by what type of dwelling unit. As I said, it can only be a single-family dwelling, not a duplex or an apartment or a secondary suite. And guests are not provided their own kitchen facilities because our zoning bylaw does not allow for kitchens inside guest rooms. Hotels and motels are another type of accommodation, so allowed in commercial and some comprehensive development zones. So this includes the downtown core, highway gateways, parts of Lower Town, and select properties along Highway 97, as shown on the maps. And the similarity between short-term rentals and hotels and motels is that they both offer temporary accommodation to tourists. But typically, hotels and motels are much larger scale operations with several sleeping units in one or multiple buildings. And then we also have other types of accommodations, so places where people can tent an RV, in agriculture or tourist accommodation, and campgrounds. So when providing a bit of a regional context on how we handle short-term rentals in the area, 8 local jurisdictions were reviewed just to provide that context. So this included Kelowna, West Kelowna, Peachland, Penticton, Oliver, Osoyoos, the Regional District of Central Okanagan, and the Regional District of Okanagan-Similkameen. Of the 8 that were reviewed, 5 allow short-term rentals in some capacity, and 3 prohibit them. So of those that allow for short-term rentals, a business licensing requirement is the most common approach to regulation. So this includes Kelowna, West Kelowna, Penticton, and Oliver. As part of the licensing process, there are various requirements depending on the jurisdiction, ranging from health and safety inspections or self-checklists to parking plans, providing proof of owner or strata permission, proof of residency, or requiring signing of a good neighbor agreement. The RDOS uses a temporary use permit process for most of its area, with the exception of Apex Mountain, which allows for vacation rentals outright through its zoning. And under the temporary use permit process, approval is required by their board for each permit. and each of those permits undergoes a public process with notification and public information meetings. So these regulations are put in place to try to solve a particular issue or set of issues. So the types of regulations or what tools from the toolbox they've selected is going to be based on what problem they're trying to solve. So with that, we're going to look at some key considerations. So what are some of the things to consider when determining appropriate policy for regulating short-term rentals? And my report to council focuses on 3 key considerations: so housing impacts, disruption to neighbors, and unlevel playing field. And I will discuss each in a bit more detail here. So with housing considerations, there is generally a concern with short-term rentals that dwelling units will be removed from the housing stock and will have, over time, an impact on available housing or the price of housing. This is a particular concern with long-term rental housing in areas with very low to low vacancy rates or limited housing supply. It can also lead to higher rents and higher purchase prices. Although this isn't a direct relationship, as a short-term rental doesn't always remove a unit from the housing stock. So there are cases where an owner may want to do a short-term rental but has no intention of renting out long-term. This is often the case with a second home where they want flexibility to be able to use it on their own for part of the year and wouldn't ever consider having a long-term tenant, or having a suite vacant when they're not using it for whatever purpose. Or there are other cases where a suite or a home is purpose-built for the purpose of having short-term accommodation, and they wouldn't have built otherwise. So neighborhood considerations. So this is probably the most controversial. So impact on neighborhoods and disruption to neighborhoods. So the extreme example of this would be the party house, where a dwelling is used night after night to host large gatherings of people. And they're known for loud music and rowdy behavior that generally cause nuisances to their neighbors. There's also, on a less extreme example, just noise in general, when vacationers are on a different time clock than residents and tend to stay up later, and they're essentially living like you would on the weekend, but throughout the week. There's also generally additional demands for on-street parking, and general lack of awareness sometimes of local issues, of people coming from other areas. So these local issues can range from lack of wildfire awareness and potentially smoking and not being careful with their cigarette butts, to water usage during water restrictions, not being bear aware in areas where there's wildlife interfaces, or just simply not knowing things about what day garbage is supposed to go out on, or what can and can't go into a septic system. There's also these concerns in general for neighborhoods, or simply just no longer knowing your neighbors, as you have guests coming in and out all of the time, or having a quiet residential neighborhood turned into a place that's no longer only used by its residents. So historically, there has been this idea that short-term rentals are not playing by the same rules as traditional operators. And consideration of this kind of level playing field is a difficult one to address because short-term rentals are a bit different than traditional operators. So they do operate within residential units. So just the property tax structure, for example, is based on the assessment as a residence, and therefore they benefit from lower tax rates, residential as opposed to a commercial rate. And there might be other benefits in terms of lower utility rates in some areas where it's a set fee based on commercial versus residential, or differences in building standards. So business, or even simply a commercial business needs to come in for a business license, where traditionally short-term rentals have been operating without. So business licensing is one way to try to level the playing field by requiring licenses for all operators. And other places have worked to ensure the same hotel taxes, for example, are applied to short-term rentals when they are required for hotel rooms as a way to level how much money is essentially being required to book out that space. In terms of building standards, requiring health and safety inspections can address some of the issues in terms of differences between building standards of short-term rentals and other commercial ventures. But operating a commercial venture out of a residence does have some inherent differences when comparing that to running a hotel, for example, the main one being scale. So we're just going to compare some jurisdictions in terms of approaches that have been used to try to address some of these key considerations. So housing considerations, approaches to minimize the impact on housing include not allowing short-term rentals altogether, providing a cap on them, so only so many will be permitted, only allowing a resident to operate, not allowing them in certain types of dwellings, like a suite, for example, limiting how much of the year short-term rentals can occur, or a combination of these approaches. So within BC, there are many jurisdictions that have come up with their own framework, and a lot of them, there's a bit of crossover as to what requirements they put into their bylaw based on what problem they're trying to solve. So neighborhood considerations. So there's a few ways to try to address some of the issues that are common for disruption to neighbors. So one of the most common approaches used is limiting the occupancy. And the idea behind this is to deter the party house. So limiting how many people can book in and stay as a group often limits the impacts to neighbors, less people, less noise, less people, less cars, and so on. Other approaches include limiting how many guests per bedroom just to avoid overcrowding, requiring additional on-site parking to avoid kind of that overflow into the street, and good neighbor agreements to place the onus on the property owner to bring in responsible guests and to keep them accountable for their guest behavior. And again, some jurisdictions do a combination of approaches. So now I'm going to just provide a couple of examples of specific approaches that have been used. So one is not allowing short-term rentals. One is fairly permissive, and then there's one that's kind of a combination. So on one end of the spectrum, we have the city of Richmond. So they don't permit an entire house to be rented out for short-term accommodation. And I'm using Richmond as an example as they've reviewed their bylaws specifically to address short-term rentals and to prohibit them. So in the Okanagan, Peachland, Osoyoos, and the Regional District of Central Okanagan currently prohibit short-term rentals, but these bylaws have not been reviewed recently to specifically address short-term rentals. So they're kind of like in the position that Summerland is in right now. So I didn't want to get into the specifics of their approaches because it hasn't been reviewed specifically for trying to address this relatively new issue. So the Richmond approach is meant to ensure that short-term rentals do not impact the current supply of affordable housing rentals in their community. So they do allow for a shared unit rental, so up to 2 people, but with shared units, they're kind of similar to a bed and breakfast. So it's someone that is using their unit as a residence, and then they're sharing their space with guests and renting out a part of the house at any given time. So there isn't really a point where it's not being used as a residence. It's just kind of a side use. But they, in terms of allowing for an entire house to be rented out, they specifically prohibit that in their bylaw. So this type of approach requires a bit of proactive enforcement to shut down operators to ensure that units are actually kept in the long-term rental pool or used for residential purposes only. So it's a bit of policing that needs to be done. So the advantage of a restrictive approach is that it does protect housing stock and it keeps residential neighborhoods for residential uses if it's supported by active bylaw enforcement. The kind of disadvantages of a restrictive approach is that it doesn't provide additional tourist accommodation. There isn't flexibility for residents to, kind of have a side income by operating a short-term rental, and there's no licensing fees to help offset the costs of monitoring and enforcing the regulations. And without proactive bylaw enforcement, housing could be used without permission for short-term rentals, and this kind of defeats the purpose of not allowing short-term rentals in the first place. So you need that active and bylaw enforcement piece of ensuring that short-term rentals don't exist in order to protect your housing stock. So on the other end of the spectrum is the city of Penticton, which does allow for short-term rentals through business licensing. There are 4 types of vacation rentals in their program. 3 of them require business licenses. So they have a minor, a major, and a major high occupant categories. And of note, the major high occupant license requires a public process when abutting neighbors are they're given the opportunity to support or not support the short-term rental when they're proposing 7 or more guests. So 60% neighbor support is needed to run this type of short-term rental. And if 40% of the abutting neighbors oppose the high occupancy, the license application will be denied, and the operator can either run a rental with 6 guests or less, or make an appeal to council, and then council can decide. So Penticton allows for any type of dwelling to be used for short-term rental if in one of their designated zones. So they allow them in rural, urban residential, commercial, and comprehensive development zones. And short-term rental can operate year-round, and there's no residency requirements. So a property owner or a tenant with the permission of the property owner or anyone else can run the short-term rental if they obtain that business license. And to get a business license with the city of Penticton, they do require a health and safety inspection, a good neighbor agreement. They do have a licensing fee that ranges depending on the type of license. So essentially how many days per year you're renting out and whether it's a high occupancy license or not. You do require the property owner's permission. And they have a program where they require the business license number to be placed in all of their ads, and for a decal that's displayed on the unit so neighbors know that they've been licensed to operate. So Penticton had a long history of vacation rentals even before online platforms for booking came to be. So the focus of their approach was on tracking and regulating to ensure that they were safe and that they were well integrated into neighborhoods. So there's also focus on providing kind of equal opportunities to run a short-term rental regardless of kind of where you were in the community or what type of dwelling you had. So in that case, whether you had an apartment unit or a house, kind of wanted to provide the same opportunities for residents to be able to do this. So this system rewards responsible operators by allowing them to get licensed and establishes a framework for their bylaw enforcement to work off of. It also allows for a way to ensure that the units are safe through inspection and cost recovery through their licensing fees. However, it does leave the housing supply in the hands of market demands, as if you're in a particular zone, you're allowed in that zone to have a short-term rental, and so you could convert a house or a suite to be used as a short-term rental as opposed to a long-term rental at any point. Right. So another example, just to provide something kind of in between those two approaches, is the city of Kelowna. So they have a different program for whether it's a principal use in a commercial area or whether it's a secondary use in a residential area. So this is kind of a good example of how there are specific things that the community wanted addressed in terms of housing, and then they introduced kind of a two-tiered system of regulations to try to solve that problem. So they're trying to ensure that long-term rental housing supply is not negatively impacted, and then short-term renters are also good neighbors. So vacation rentals in commercial areas are less restricted than those in residential areas. And so essentially we're in commercial areas where hotels are already allowed, they have less restrictions than in the residentials. So as a secondary use, so this is for residential areas, they have one set of rules to allow for short-term rentals, but only as a secondary use. So essentially what that means is that they want to restrict that. So the primary use is always going to be the residence, and then this is allowed as something else. So it applies to rural residential, urban residential, and select commercial zones. And short-term rentals are allowed in all unit types except for secondary suites and carriage houses. And secondary suites and carriage houses specifically were called out as a significant supply of their long-term rental units. And so they wanted to preserve their rental housing supply by not allowing them to be converted over to short-term rentals. There's also an occupancy limit of 6 adults. So based on, they have a maximum of 3 sleeping units or bedrooms, essentially, with a maximum of 2 adults per bedroom in the zoning bylaws. So through those regulations, there's a maximum of 6 adults. The groups can be a bit bigger because they don't count children in the occupancy count. So it could be 6 adults plus kids. So as a secondary use in those residential areas, it's only the resident of the dwelling that can operate the short-term rental. So they do not need to be present during this during the stay of the vacation rental, but they do need to live on the premises for 8 months out of the year. This leaves 125 days where the unit can be run as a short-term rental. And as part of the licensing program, they do ask for proof of residence. But I will note that non-residency is very difficult to prove, and many people that don't actually live there full-time still have a lot of the supporting documents that the City of Kelowna asks for when they're getting a license. So, for example, a driver's license with an address of the property that's being rented out, or utility bills that are in their name, even if they don't actually live on site there. So the other category for short-term rentals in Kelowna is for commercial areas, and they are allowed as a principal use in these areas. And they are permitted year-round and without any residency requirements. So anybody can operate with owner's permission, and if it's in a strata, with the strata's permission as well. And the idea behind this was that commercial areas already allow for hotels and motels, so it was seen to be compatible to allow for short-term rentals in those areas without residency restrictions. So when applying for a business license with the City of Kelowna, they require a parking plan to show adequate parking on site. They do require a good neighbor agreement, like the City of Penticton does. A little bit different though, they do a self-evaluation fire and safety checklist. So it is the applicant that is going through that checklist and signing off on it, but an inspection isn't automatically done as part of their licensing program. Rather, they reserve the right to inspect for compliance at any time. And then they will do periodic kind of random inspections based on their capacity to do so. And for secondary use licenses, as I said before, part of the licensing requirement is providing that proof of residency and showing documentation that that unit actually is where you live. So kind of pros and cons of the two-tier approach is that it uses additional residency restrictions to keep residential areas residential, while also allowing for some flexibility. Allows for flexibility programs to allow for year-round rentals in commercial areas where other types of tourist accommodation already occur. And it tries to balance the need for housing with being able to supply additional tourist beds in the community and to allow for some flexibility of people, of residents to earn additional income by renting suites or short-term rentals. And then they've also chosen, as I said before, to keep suites and carriage houses for long-term rentals only. But with all of these additional restrictions comes additional demands for licensing and bylaw enforcement. And it may provide incentive for some short-term rentals to kind of go underground and operate without a license because they aren't able to obtain one. So this would be in the case of a non-resident that wishes to operate, but they wouldn't be able to get a license to do so, or somebody that has a suite, especially an undocumented suite, and then they just start renting that out because they know that they can't get a license to do it. And then they wait for bylaw enforcement. All right, so on to recommendations. So just given the comparison of jurisdictions, staff's proposing that Summerland use the City of Penticton as a starting point to draft the bylaw to allow for short-term rentals in any type of dwelling year-round without residency restrictions. With the same kind of occupancy limits to 6 people without that further public consultation element. So the draft bylaw would propose permitting short-term rentals in rural, urban, residential, commercial, and comprehensive zones that allow for dwellings, which are the zones shown on the map there. And this would be with a business licensing program. So to ensure that safe units are provided, we'd look at doing a health and safety inspection and to establish a framework to try to lessen neighborhood disruption, we'd be looking at a good neighbor agreement as part of the licensing requirements. And then of course, we'd also be evaluating licensing fees to try to establish a way to recoup the costs of running the licensing program and bylaw enforcement as well. So it's also recommended that staff initiate public engagement on the draft bylaw so that if there's any community priorities that need to be identified, it can come through in that process. And then out of this, we might identify some additional restrictions or things that need to be addressed as part of that. And we're looking to essentially turn that City of Penticton model into a Summerland model based on some of the identified community priorities. During this time, we're also going to explore options for bylaw support and monitoring services that can help the licensing program be successful. So today, staff is seeking direction from council just to ensure that we're on the same page for moving forward with the project. And so we're looking for direction on the type of regulatory framework for regulating short-term rentals and to initiate that public engagement strategy. So as I mentioned, our recommendation is that this framework be based on that permissive, regulated approach like the City of Penticton's, with acknowledging that further public engagement will be necessary in order to be able to tailor that draft bylaw to an approach that works for Summerland. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. That's quite a comprehensive report. I very much appreciate it. Nice job. Okay, council, questions of Joanne or Brad? Councillor Holmes.
Yes, thank you. The stats you gave us for Summerland at the beginning, do carriage houses, are they considered entire units or a single family house? How is a carriage unit quantified there?
You're referring to the map of the 174 units that are currently being rented. Those are, just to give you an idea of where that map and those stats came from, there are several companies that provide monitoring services. So they have, they basically have ways of using technology to dredge all of those websites and put that information together. And so the way that they would categorize it would be on how it's categorized in the online platforms. So it would be like a whole unit. So they would consider a secondary suite or a carriage house to be a whole unit, but they did specifically identify single-family dwellings as being that 92%.
Okay, Councillor Holmes. Okay. Councillor Van Elfen.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So in most cases, stratas are self-policing. So like the strata council will agree or disagree to allow, the Airbnb type platform, but they'll also penalize and fine their own residents if they're not obeying. So that's we don't have to worry about strata. Am I correct?
Yeah, so stratas do have the additional benefit of being able to put in their own restrictions. So if a strata community doesn't want to see short-term rentals, they write that into their own bylaws, and then they come up with their own fines on violating their own bylaws. Okay. When I was mentioning obtaining strata permission from the city of Kelowna, it was basically them verifying that strata community supports short-term rentals and it wouldn't violate the strata's bylaws. Not every community does that. It's actually fairly unique, I'd say, or not unique, but in the minority of requiring strata permission, usually it's property owner permission for the application.
So, but it would be, excuse me, it would be a good way to, if I own a unit in a strata complex, that I have to get the strata's approval to get a license from the district.
Correct. Yeah, and they did that because they didn't want to have circumstances where they were approving licenses that weren't supported by the strata. The fallout of that is the expectation that that the city is going to be policing those strata bylaws when there's violations, as opposed to the strata policing them.
So, and if I can ask another question, if I may. So I'm always puzzled, why no cooking facilities? In like an Airbnb or any rent like that type of platform. Why are they saying no cooking facilities?
So generally, short-term rentals do have cooking facilities because it's an entire house. For bed and breakfasts, traditionally it's been no cooking facilities to try to avoid the scenario where, like, so a dwelling unit kind of has three elements: cooking facilities, like a separate entrances with washroom facilities and also sleeping facilities. So if you start adding additional kitchens to one dwelling, then you can start to see that there could be multiple dwellings then operating within a house, which is generally why they don't allow for those additional kitchens for a bed and breakfast. But those same types of regulations don't usually translate to a short-term rental because they usually do have that complete set of sleeping facilities, washrooms, and cooking facilities all in one.
Okay, and then Kelowna does a self-evaluation for health and safety. Is that something that we would look at here, or do we have the capacity to inspect each and every place when they apply?
That is something that I would like to look in further with our building inspectors. So Penticton, for example, they do inspect every property, but they have the benefit of having a licensing officer that also used to be a building inspector. So they have a dual role. So they're very lucky. We would have to come up with something that works for Summerland based on the resources that we have.
Right.
And if we were to initiate a program, we do have a benefit of actually 174 rental is not that large in comparison to a lot of other communities in the Okanagan. So depending on how it's framed and how streamlined a licensing program is, it might not be too difficult to provide those services, but it would probably take a dedicated kind of blitz to get most of them into the program. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Councillor Holmes?
Yeah, would you be able to elaborate a bit on the West Kelowna model, the operator residency model, how that works?
Sure. Dallas is probably more up to speed on this than me. So that model is, I would say, similar to Kelowna, but I'm just trying to grab my notes on West Kelowna. One moment. Yeah, so they allow for their rentals mostly in their kind of rural residential and larger lot residential areas with a maximum of no more than 4 bedrooms to kind of limit occupancy. And then they have interesting duration limits for an operator to only be absent for up to 14 days per month. And then they have a maximum of 30 days in a year for the short-term rental. So it's, but I would want to clarify a bit of those details because I'm just reading off of my sheet. Was there a specific question that you wanted to get out of that?
Yeah, if I may. So, you know, if I, to me, there's two things that we need to really think seriously about. One is housing availability in this community, and the other is the neighborhood considerations that you mentioned in your presentation. And it's not just the noise and partying, but if I think of my neighborhood, we have. You know, it's an amazing neighborhood, and all the neighbors know each other and help each other, and we get it's what Summerland, living in Summerland, is all about. As far as I'm concerned, it's a real sense of community, and there are a few houses around where the people have carriage houses or secondary suites, which they rent as vacation rentals, and that's fine, but every house is occupied by a resident. So there's no gaps in the street, right? And it's, as I said, a great sense of community. I know there are other streets in Summerland where it's not like that, where half half the houses are vacation rentals, and they've lost that sense of community. I think we need to, think in terms of that too. And to me, the simple thing, what I've heard about Penticton is that it's pretty cumbersome, and getting, approvals from your neighbors and signing neighborhood agreements. I think we should consider, something simple like the owner must live on the property. I think we need to think what it is, what principles are we operating under? But I don't think this vacation rental should be a full-time business operation, which many of these places are, right? And I'd encourage you to look at Tofino's bylaws, because they've been dealing with this for a long time. I've been, for the last 6 years attending workshops at UBCM, talking to other councillors from other communities to see what they do. And it's, as you demonstrate, it's all over the place. And I just really concerned about using Penticton as our starting point. That if you start with the if you start with a more restrictive approach, then it'd be easier down the road to make it more permissive. But if you start with the most permissive right off the bat, and then later you find you need to make it more restrictive, that's going to be much more difficult to do. So I'd be curious to know more about West Kelowna, and I certainly encourage us to look at Tofino. Thanks.
Okay, Brad, and then I'll go to Councillor Barkwell.
Just if I may, in response through the chair to Councillor Holmes' comments, in terms of our rationale for our recommendation, first off, I do want to state that in Joanne's presentation, we are kind of using Penticton as a baseline, but it's not the exact same model as what Penticton has in place. For example, we're not recommending the neighborhood agreement portion of their structure, where you have to, if there's more than 6 patrons in this short-term rental, then you'd have to get a neighborhood notification, kind of go through this quasi-public review and approval process. We're not recommending that. We are recommending a simplified approach, similar to the more streamlined approach they have for less than 6 people per home, and just restricting anything more than 6. So that's a little difference between us and Penticton. And then on with regards to your second comment on whether we start restrictive and go to permissive, or start permissive and then go to restrictive, we could have structured it either way in terms of going forward. I think that as we go forward in the community consultation process, it will become more restrictive inherently, just due to new concerns being brought forward. It's similarly what happened with the agritourism accommodation process. Same thing happened there. We became more restrictive versus less. So we think this is a good baseline for us to start, is following that simplified permissive approach. And then as we go through this, more discussion with council, more discussion with the community, it'll become, like Joanne has indicated, a made in Summerland model. So just that in response.
Councillor Barkwell.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm understanding everything entirely correctly. If you have the model in Kelowna where you have to live in the residence, does that essentially make all short-term rentals B&Bs? Is there a distinction there? Perhaps Councillor Holmes can help me on that one.
I think we'll defer to staff, and then Councillor Holmes can certainly add into this.
Yeah, so there's kind of 2 distinct things when you're talking about a resident being in the home. So one is whether it is that resident's or the operator's full-time residence. So what Kelowna requires is that for 8 months out of the year, they're living on that property. And then the remainder of the year, they can use it as a short-term rental. They're not required to be on site during that short-term rental. So that's the biggest difference between a bed and breakfast and a short-term rental, is whether the operator is actually physically on site while the guests are staying there.
Right, I see.
But with Kelowna, that residence, even though there's a point where guests are staying there, it's only for a portion of the year. The rest of the year, it's used as somebody's home.
Or not at all.
Or not at all. That can happen too.
Yeah, go ahead, Councillor Holmes.
Yeah, if it's a carriage house or a secondary suite, you have your own cooking facilities, your own entrance, and everything like that. So you're separate from the primary resident of the place. But and yeah, you would lose some potential rental housing with the carriage house or secondary suite. But what you gain is you still have a primary resident living there all the time, and so you don't lose that sense of community in that neighborhood where people are coming and going all the time, who you don't know who your neighbor is. And I think this is a real danger, and this is fracturing communities all over the place. So.
Obviously, we're going to have to wait to hear more from our community, as it seems like each community is different. But I certainly do agree with the idea that you don't want houses that are turned into commercial short-term rentals. You want to be able to have the individual owner sort of be able to do it when they want to do it for a short period. I know a number of people who would move out of their own house during Ironman. A lot of staff maybe haven't been here during the Ironman, but it's nuts. You know, the demand for accommodation, and people could make thousands of dollars to move out of their house for a week, and it doesn't really do any harm. And that's one end of the scale, and the other end of the scale is is the neighborhoods and the areas like Councillor Holmes talks about. So I haven't seen any solution yet, but still looking.
Councillor Van Alphen?
Thank you. Kind of goes back to it. Well, I don't know, kind of goes with what Councillor Holmes was saying. I know people that have a self-contained secondary suite with cooking facility that rent out for short-term rentals. And if they weren't renting it out for short-term rentals, it wouldn't be rented out at all, because they're not going to rent it out for long-term. You know, there's just no way, because of the Rentals Act and all those types of things. So if they want those people to vacate, then it's very difficult at times to remove a renter. So they use them for short-term rentals, you know, as an Airbnb type platform, but there are kitchens and stuff like that, but people come and they go. You know, that I don't see a problem with, because they're living in the home. Like, the owners are still living there. So, you know, I think that's a huge part of it, that the owner should be living on site. We see it a lot in another area in our community, Trout Creek, where there's tons of homes that are, you know, solely just used as short-term rentals for a great part of the year. And it totally disrupts neighborhoods for the summertime. And, you know, so I mean, if the owner's living on site in that building, the owner has the ability to, you know, hey, you got to tone it down. I have neighbors, or you need to party more, you know, whatever. But the owner should be on site.
Councillor Barkle?
Well, first, let me say, is there anybody else? Nobody's put up their hand, okay. I go along with what Councillor Van Alphen has said. I know of people who have built 2 houses specifically with like in-law suites, totally legal and everything, but they don't rent them out long-term or anything like that. It's a little bit of extra income for a short period of time in the summer, and then family and stuff have a place to stay when they visit. And I'd like to be able to see that as being a legitimate short-term rental when it's a carriage house or a suite. But like I say, we're waiting to hear. We might be getting ahead of ourselves, but I think that's what you're saying, right, Councillor Van Alphen? And I'm thinking along those lines too.
Brad?
Just wanted to maybe warn, I appreciate the comments, Councillor Barkwell, with regards to waiting to hear from the public, because we do have to keep in mind that of the stats that we currently are dealing with today, 174 units, as determined by these agencies, have determined 92% are in single-family homes. That means majority of these units are being rented out wholeheartedly, right? So there will be impacts if we go forward to the regulation, like owner has to be on the property at the same time. That means 90% of 174 are no longer allowed within the community.
I'm just going to go to Councillor Traynor first, and then I'll go back to you, Councillor Van Alphen, and then I have a question as well.
I think I live down in Trout Creek, and it is true there are a lot of vacation rental homes down where I am. I think one of the biggest things for me is being able to regulate them. So if there are issues that neighbors are seeing, like for example, I know one house, the garbage is always put out like the night before, even a day or two before, and it sits out on the street for that long. So just having strong, I guess, bylaws or fines that that the neighbors around in the area can phone and report if they see infractions happening. Like, to me, that's important. I mean, if they're running an Airbnb or whatever, a vacation rental, and there's no issues, like I don't really have a problem with it, but it's just when the people that are coming to stay don't respect the neighbors. I want to be able to know that I can phone and report this, and that action will be taken. So that to me is important, and it'll be interesting to hear the feedback from the public, but I think that we're probably going to hear that as well.
Councillor Van Alphen.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Question through to Brad. So in those stats that you guys are able to pull, it doesn't mean every one, like some of those could be suites. Like, because there's like the homeowner could be living there and the other part could be a suite or an Airbnb. That doesn't mean they're completely vacant homes and they're only being rented out to Airbnbs. Am I wrong in assuming what I'm thinking here?
So of the stats that they provided, so 90% of that 174 are single family homes that are being rented out as the entire home. And then 92% is renting an entire unit. So that could be, so there's a discrepancy of 2% between single family homes and other fully contained units. So that could be a secondary suite or a carriage house or an apartment unit. Okay. And then 8% is shared, which means that there is, in 8% of the cases, there's common facilities with the operator. So like they're booking out a room or a series of rooms within the dwelling.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'd say it's probably about 2%
wow.
of that.
My question is, and I don't know if you've had or been able to actually do this, but if you look at the map it talks about what Councillor Van Alphen was just asking you about. It has the statistics on it. It shows 174 rental units, unique rental units. If you took that map and you overlaid it with the zoning map, My question is, and again, I'm not sure if you have done this or if you're able to do that, how much, I guess, how many of those unique rental units would be outside of, well, depending on what it is that the community wants to see in Summerland, how much of that would potentially cause an impact because the zoning is wrong? Does that make any sense? Like if you've got those little squares and you overlaid that on our zoning map, how many of those little squares are out of order, say?
So I actually did overlay that, but because, and they kind of do these maps kind of very granular on purpose so that it's not specifically pinpointing. They're giving you a very like general indication as to where they are. So I would say that in terms of actually being able to identify the specific zoning, wouldn't be that accurate to overlay them, but I'd say in general, you can see kind of hot spots in the Trout Creek area, which is primarily residential zones with some agriculture, but I would suspect that that area, if we allowed them in residential zones, would be fairly compliant. There's also a large clustering kind of lower town to Crescent Beach, as well as a clustering in the downtown. So again, those areas would be allowing for kind of residential or residential and commercial. So I would say that they would generally overlap, but I suspect that there would be some properties that are agricultural that we haven't I haven't addressed whether that would be something that would be permitted in an agricultural area. I just was proposing to follow what Penticton was doing and allowing them in residential, rural residential, and commercial areas. So I'd say a general overlap, but the data that they provide is specifically not able to pinpoint addresses.
Right, good, thank you. It's the agricultural zoning that may be problematic. Counselor, sorry, Director of Development Services.
I've been promoted. Demoted. I think that's a good consideration for council as well, and maybe one we can get some direction on is agricultural zones. The challenge with agricultural zones is the ALC. Right now, we have allowed the agritourism accommodation as within their agricultural land use regulations. So that was kind of, I guess, dealing with agricultural properties. But right now, just for council's benefit, we don't allow carriage homes or secondary suites within agricultural properties. So if this was something council would want to consider in those uses, keep in mind that would mean that it'd be only those properties where the entire home is being rented out.
Thank you. Councillor Carlson.
Are you sure that we didn't change it to allow secondary suites on agricultural land? I believe we did.
I apologize. Maybe that has
I think we are, yeah, it is permitted now. May I continue? Yes. Okay. I was doing a little cruising through Airbnb, and there's 126 properties, and there's a lot of guest suites and guest houses, which are seem to be complementary to a main residential, lots of one bedroom attached to a home. So I think that it's important that the conversation include, I think focusing on that would be important. I don't know if we need to necessarily start by going as far as Penticton, or as lenient as Penticton, but I do think that it's important to recognize there's a lot of secondary suites, whether or not they're legal or not. That seems to be the majority of items on here. And I do think that a lot of them are on ALR land. and that's not likely going to change. The people who are using those spaces aren't necessarily going to be doing agriculture, but they're certainly going to enjoy being there. And I think in 2022, it's going to change even more when the ALC allows more buildings on agricultural land. So I do think that we're going to have to talk about what that restriction might look like and what might be permitted and what might be too much.
Councillor Van Elfen?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. No, going back to the agricultural, like secondary suite on agricultural land for say, if it's in, right now, it's allowed in the main dwelling. And if it was run as an Airbnb, that's what a lot of people are coming for. They're coming here for the agricultural experience. They'll book in that area for the reason, you know, or if that's not what they want, they book in to another area, you know, such as Trout Creek, because they want to be close to the water. But there's other people that want to come out to an agricultural place, let's say residents with their children, because that's the experience they want. You know, so I mean, there's room for all of it, I think. But, you know, I don't have a problem with, you know, like legalizing and getting them up to, you know, some type of legal standard. Thank you.
Are there any more questions of staff? Councillor Patton.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I noticed existing accommodations, 22 bed and breakfasts. I guess my question is, out of those 22 bed and breakfasts that are licensed, how many of those do you think are on the platforms in the 174 unique rental units? I would assume that it's all 22 that are already licensed.
Not sure if traditional bed and breakfasts, some of them might do online booking platforms. Some of them may not, but they would they would be within that 8% for the shared unit accommodation, because they would be booking like one room or like a shared space.
Well, that's not what the bylaw says. The bylaw says you can have up to, one license is 1 to 3 bedrooms. Out of that 1 to 3 bedrooms, our bylaw is very unique, which is very good because it talks of self-catered, which you don't have to serve breakfast. It's a self-catered. So there is some opportunity for bed and breakfast in Summerland to be licensed and to be on those platforms, which does make it legal to be on the platform for those bed and breakfasts. So just another scenario that we need to look at when, as we go through the public process on this. Thanks.
Councillor Barkwell?
Yeah, I'd be interested when the staff is doing their research and such as also lots of different communities have tried different things, and then the question is, well, how did it work? And I don't know, that's a little more subjective, but there's probably something that, you know, a phone call to your colleague in another community or something which has some specific rules would be useful feedback. And the other thing that comes to mind with Councillor Patton's comments is there's probably more than are on the websites that your sort of metadata gets. Because I know a lot of people, they would advertise on VRBO until they've built up a client. They get the same guys, and then they don't pay that whatever fee is, and they come back year after year.
Yeah, I did reach out to Kelowna and Penticton and Soyuz and a few other, Nelson and a few other communities, and chatted with them about how their programs were going. Most of them did say that there's a lot of growing pains in the first couple of years in terms of trying to get everybody on board and going through the process. one interesting note of from Kelowna was that they are they're going to be re-reviewing their licensing requirements because they actually believe that the application requirements are too, they're asking for too much information. They're feeling that they may have been asking for too much and making it too onerous up front. And they actually, one, don't have the capacity to go through all of that information in order to issue the license. So everything that you require, you need to have staff to review it. And then the other part of that equation is the enforcement of some of those regulations and how that plays out over time. That comment about how difficult it is to prove residency or non-residency is kind of a direct comment from Kelowna staff on how difficult it is to enforce some of the regulations that are put in place.
Brad, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, if I may, thanks, Joanne, for that answer. That's fantastic. And I just want to add, like, we do benefit, I guess, in coming forward now with our approach and learning from other jurisdictions and what has worked well and what hasn't worked well. And so Joanne has made these calls on our behalf. And definitely the kind of moral of the story and kind of summarizing is the simpler the better. That if we overregulate too much at the front end of things, we overcomplicate the process, then we turn people away from the process, and therefore resulting in more enforcement workload and trying to chase people into it. So whatever approach that council recommends, my administrative approach is we simplify as much as we can, whether we do have owner occupied or whatever the provisions are, in order to encourage people to get those licenses and get approvals in place.
Thank you. Any other questions of staff? Are we ready for a motion? Get that on the floor. Anybody? Okay, the motion speaks to modeling our approach after the city of Penticton and developing a made in Summerland version of that. If you'd like to have something that is starting with less permissive than the city of Penticton, then fill in the blank. Did you? Okay, Councillor Patton.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm just opening up. I had to go to our public site because I would not download. I think that as we move into the public process, I'd like just to go forward with the staff recommendation, if I may. That council directs staff to draft a regulatory framework based on a permissive regulated approach modeled after the city of Penticton to allow and license short-term rentals, and that council directs staff to initiate the public engagement strategy on short-term rentals to receive feedback on the draft regulatory framework and to identify any additional priorities tailored to the District of Summerland context for consideration.
Thank you. And seconder, Councillor Van Elfen. Now further discussion on this. Councillor Holmes and then Councillor Van Elfen.
Yeah, I don't think I'll be supporting this. I don't think the City of Penticton is the model that we want to start with. I really think we need to make it clear that we don't see short-term rentals as a business opportunity. And from my observation, what works best is the owner-occupied approach. And maybe we'll get there through this, but I would rather that we start with that than end up there. And so.
Councillor Van Elfen and then Councillor Barkwell and then Councillor Patton and Trainer.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I can appreciate what Councillor Holmes is saying. I'm hoping that we can get somewhere in that area also, but I also do appreciate what our planner was saying. More regulations is going to just drive more people underground, and my concern is health and safety. I think it's really important that, I think Kelowna had an approach once upon a time for secondary suites and stuff, and Councillor Patton can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was more along the lines of, it was all along the lines of health and safety. They wanted people to identify those illegal suites, so to speak. And the biggest thing was not shutting them down. It was to make sure that the health and safety part was there. Egress windows and fire extinguishers and smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors and all these things. That was more important, So I think I don't want to see it so restrictive that everybody goes underground. And Councillor Barkwell nailed it really good. There's lots of people that have done this for years and have a great clientele built up, and they're not on any platform. They just have return customers coming year after year. So they're not in our matrix on that map. But it'd be nice to bring everybody into compliance. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Van Elfen. Councillor Barkwell?
Just to clarify, and Councillor Holmes, when you talk about the owner-occupied model of Kelowna, are you thinking like, what was there? So you could rent it out for 4 months short-term, but you only 4 months? And is that what you were thinking about, or?
You want me to answer? Yeah. Well, I mean, we could look at that too, but no, I was thinking that the owner has to live on the property. That's what I'm thinking. And I don't think that requires more regulation. I think actually that requires less, because when you have absent owners, getting an absent owner to come into compliance is going to be much more difficult than somebody who's actually living there. So I don't buy that just because it's more restrictive, it's more you can have less regulations it's because it's simple. It's a very simple approach. Mm-hmm. If you live there, no problem, go for it. If you don't, it's pretty simple. And
I mean, I didn't. Okay, so that now I understand that, because I didn't think that model solved anything either. And the Kelowna, you got to ostensibly live there for at least 8 months of the year. But then if you go with what you're suggesting, where you have to actually live there, then every one of them is kind of like a in-law suite or a bed and breakfast, I guess. That's about the only thing that you could have, isn't it? Is that just to understand what you're thinking?
You want me to reply?
I think that maybe I'll come back to you two
Sure.
fellows. There are 3 people waiting to weigh in on this, so we'll do that first.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I would like to address one point that Councillor Holmes indicated, and that was in regards to the business, and I think it is a business. I think that people that are going into short-term rentals are doing it based on the dollars that they can make in a short period of time, hence short-term rentals. As alluding to Councillor Van Elpen, BC Building Code doesn't care if your house burns down. BC Building Code cares that the people that are in that house get out and that the early warning systems are there. So if I would rather see secondary suites and carriage houses come into the vacation rental stream that are right now are illegal than to have them out there with no health and safety inspection, where perhaps there isn't working smoke alarms, perhaps there isn't egress, as Councillor Van Elpen had alluded to. But I think that we do need a Summerland model that is built for Summerland, not the same as Penticton, not the same as Kelowna, but I think that there are aspects of both that we can look at. But I don't think that we can not say that the people that have these are not business people, because it truly is mortgage helpers, or it is for revenue generation. So, thank you.
Thank you. And that's the business license aspect of it, right?
That's true.
Councillor Traynor and then Councillor Carlson.
I think the City of Penticton approach is a place where we can start. So I'm okay with that. And you know, if people don't like it, or if they would like to see the homeowners be on site as well, they can always leave those comments, right? Like we can, okay, so we can, this is just a starting point. We can see what we get back and then tailor it to what we need in Summerland. That's correct?
Through the chair to Councilor Trainer, yeah, exactly. That's kind of the idea of rolling this out, is we hear more from the public as to what they want to see before council makes a decision.
Okay, and so my second point is I think that public engagement is really important, and I think that we're going to have to really push, make sure that people know that this is going on and how they can leave their feedback, especially, I mean, down in my neighborhood in Trout Creek where we do have a lot of these. You know, I don't want to hear from my neighbors that they didn't know about this, and so I'm willing to spread the word, but I think it's going to be really important that we you know, go down as many avenues as we can so that people know what's going on and that they know that they can leave their feedback and that we want to hear from them.
Thank you. Councillor Carlson.
I think it's interesting that we're finally at this point. I know we've been talking about this for a long time, and one of the things about it that I think is helpful is that so many other communities have already gone through this process. As I'm sitting here thinking about that, I also note that we can see exactly what's available in Summerland, and this is with no bylaws or regulations currently in place. And so I'm wondering if through part of this process, how valuable it is to look at, you know, somewhere like Tofino and somewhere like Penticton, then also look at those statistics and see if all of these rules that are being in place are actually doing anything to regulate how many homes versus just suites versus, like, if it's actually being enforced or followed by the people who are participating in this program. I don't know if that's going too far, but I it's almost like there'd be like a case study to be done at some point to determine if city councils across North America are wasting too much time talking about regulating things differently. Maybe Richmond has 500 Airbnbs listed on there, even though they say they're not allowed to have any. So in the long run, we need to just think about what it is we're trying to accomplish, and maybe Councillor Patton's right. Maybe we're trying to make sure that it's done safely. But maybe Councillor Holmes is also right, in that we want to also ensure that people remember that we're in a small community and that you need to know who your neighbors are. So I think focusing on that is more important than focusing too much on exactly how many days of the year and how many people are allowed.
Joanne? So you're responding to a question? Go ahead, please.
I just wanted to add that there are services that are available to get to your point of kind of who's operating and how many people are operating outside of the licensing program. So there are services that that can monitor those sites and then provide data back to municipalities, and that's what they do as part of their the process. So that pretty much every municipality that I spoke to uses some sort of monitoring service to evaluate how many licenses they have versus how many online listings there are, and then automate providing notices when they see properties pop up that are being listed that aren't in their licensing database.
Okay, any further discussion? We have a motion that it's been seconded and it's on the floor. Okay, I'll call the question. Are everyone's comfortable with the motion? You remembers where it is, where we're at? Okay, all in favor? And opposed? Councillor Holmes is opposed, so that carries. Thank you. Thank you, Joanne and Brad. That's a good, robust report. Now on to, I guess this is Brad, yes, speaking to us about the Development Services monthly update.
Thank you, Your Worship. Let's wait till my slides come up here. There we go. Okay, as I am in front of you every month, once a month, just providing a short update on activities from the Development Services Department. Next slide, please. So with regards to development applications, we just looking at updated stats here for all of our planning and land use applications. If you compared this to the previous month, it's actually gone down a bit in terms of our total number of planning applications that we were receiving kind of on a monthly basis from April, May, June, and then moving into July. It's kind of slipped down lower, and in terms of a cooling off period, we did have a total of 4 development permits and 3 development variance permits in July submitted, but no new rezonings and no new subdivisions. So you know, that does indicate it is slowing down a bit in terms of the planning side of things, but we are still busy with the Council's priority projects, such as short-term rentals as an example. I do want to state too, we've recently just completed some activities on Hunters Hill, provided a substantial completion. I believe the CEO mentioned that at the last council meeting in his CEO report for phase 1 subdivision, as well as providing occupancy for the first home to be finally completed there in Hunters Hill. So a couple of positive tidbits there from that development. Next slide. With regards to building permits, it's kind of a similar trend for July as planning applications. We had a total of 10 permits issued in July, which is also down compared to the month of June, which had 22 applications, and also, 22 for the year of 2020, but 19 in the month of June, this past June. So you can see that both planning and buildings kind of cooled off in July, and just kind of thinking about why that may have occurred, it definitely might be related to the COVID-19 restrictions lifting in early July. People were busy getting on their vacationing and interregional travel instead of starting new building and planning projects at home, potentially, as my inducement kind of considered there. But there could be other factors as well driving that recent slowdown. Next slide. But the one area where we haven't slowed down, in fact, we've grown exponentially in the month of July, is in bylaw enforcement. We had a total of 159 bylaw enforcement files submitted in July alone, that 1 month, bringing our yearly total to date to 641 files open to date. So just kind of doing the math there, that represents 5 new complaint files opened each day for the month of July of complaints being submitted. And each one of those complaints requires follow-up from our officers with investigation with each complainant and going on site, and also mediation between homeowners potentially to rectify those issues. So with having only 1 full-time officer and 1 part-time officer for weekend coverage, it's definitely straining those 2 individuals right now with that increased number of workload. Just looking at the types of files that we received, you can see the different types of good neighbor bylaw just recently adopted by council is at 19 for the month of July. So already we're seeing lots of activity with regards to that new bylaw in terms of nuisance impacts to neighborhoods. Another new thing for July that was implemented in early July is the stage 2 water restrictions, where we had a total of 28 complaints from neighbors, probably with regards to people not obeying their stage 2 restrictions. And so that's where that increase is coming from. And the next slide is just a total summary of the total complaints received to date for the year of 2021. You can see the majority is related to traffic and zoning, and then following is public land and property maintenance, and then snow removal for the winter months. But happy to take any questions on this report, plus any of the specific applications that are listed in the report.
Thank you. Councillor Carlson.
Does traffic include parking tickets?
It's a great question, Councillor Carlson, through the chair. It does. However, we haven't had a lot of tickets issued for parking tickets over the years. We do have a 2-hour parking restriction, for example, downtown, which I would say is loosely enforced. But we do have parking violations happening significantly actually down on Lakeshore Drive right now.
I was talking to a friend who owns a business down there, and a bunch of her staff got parking tickets, and they were for $5. And so I just thought, maybe we should, I don't know if we need to talk about that, but it was kind of funny, and also probably a good thing because it's pretty affordable.
Any other questions on this report? Okay, could I have someone bring forward it for information, to receive for information, please? Thank you, Councillor Patton. Councillor Holmes, all in favor? Thank you. Now to our late item. 9.4 has to do with 2107 Tate Street, and my understanding is this is just an administrative. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So the official community plan amendment bylaw number 2020-019 and the zoning amendment bylaw 2020-020 for 2107 Tate Street had been given third reading at the November 9th, 2020 evening council meeting. Upon reviewing the bylaws, an administrative error was noted in the mapping and the legal description of the property. The public notice and the public hearing materials have the correct mapping and legal description, so they were properly presented to the public, properly consulted on. To correct this error, staff is recommending that third reading for both bylaws be rescinded and be read again for the third time as amended.
Okay, could someone bring that forward? Thank you, Councillor Holmes. So rescinding and then third reading it again. Sorry, I need a seconder still. Thank you, Councillor Van Elfen. Any questions or discussion on this? Okay, I'll call the question. All in favor? And none opposed. Thank you. Let's see. Is there any notice of motion? Okay. Was this to do with the correspondence piece?
Yeah, so I can bring it forward in correspondence, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is right next. Thank you, Councillor Holmes. So there are 5 pieces of correspondence, and I will give the floor to Councillor Holmes, please.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to bring forward the Summerland Arts Council letter regarding the naming of the Arts Council or the Arts Center building, and I'd like to. I just want to talk about the letter a bit and then bring a motion forward. So the Arts Council letter. First, I was pleased that they recognized George Reig ought to be honored in a meaningful way. I was a bit disappointed they didn't provide any real recommendations of what we should name after George Reig as we had requested. And I'm a little confused why they don't think the Arts and Cultural Center would be an appropriate venue to name after him. The letter suggests that the building already has a name, but it doesn't. It's not named the Blagborn Building. It was dedicated by Mayor Blagborn when the building opened as a public library. It wasn't dedicated to him, so I think it's a difference that should be recognized. I've never heard it be called the Arts Council building. I think most people in this community call it the old library. And they still call the new library, even though the new library is now 6 years old. And I think the new library will continue to be called the new library and the old library will continue to be called the old library until we give the old library a new name. So, secondly, I don't really follow the argument in the letter that calling the building the Summerland Community Arts and Culture Center is important to the Arts Council's branding.
Excuse me, Councillor
Yeah.
Holmes. Might I ask you to bring forward a motion first, and then I will go right back to you and have you continue with the background, because it's really good information to provide us with a lot of context.
Sure. Okay. So
Thank
my
you.
motion. My motion is that council supports the naming of one of Summerland's public libraries, secondary school, or the Arts and Cultural Center after George Riga, and that staff be directed to send a letter to the Okanagan Regional Library Board requesting the Summerland branch be renamed the George Riga branch, and that staff be directed to send a letter to the School District 67 Board of Trustees requesting Summerland Secondary School be renamed George Riga Secondary School, and that staff be directed to send a letter to the Summerland Arts Council Board of Directors in response to its letter dated August 13th, 2021, to provide clarification and request support for naming the new Arts and Cultural Building as the George Riga Arts and Cultural Center. So, as I was saying, there's...
Sorry, just 1 second.
Yep.
Let's get a seconder, please. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, Councillor
So,
Holmes.
sorry, I was speaking to the letter and then I was going to make a motion and speak to the motion, but so I'm still kind of referring to the letter, but so in Penticton, the Penticton Arts Council operates out of the Lear House, and I don't think that has any real impact on their branding. And the Many Hats Theater operates out of the Cannery Stage, and it's the product that's important to the branding. It's not the name of the building you operate out of. And there's also I think that we need to recognize that the Arts Council co-manages that building. Not for themselves, but for the benefit of the community, and it's it's the community, and I like to note the letter concludes that they understand this is a district building, and that the naming of the building is the decision of the district. That's what it says in the letter. The board meeting which I attended. When they discussed this, I got a sense that some of the directors weren't comfortable making a recommendation to us one way or another. They felt it wasn't really their place to do so. And I also note that in the letter, they suggest a venue of some sort would be appropriate to name after George Riga. At the meeting I attended, some of the board directors asked why couldn't the public library or the high school be named after Riga? And I think that's a fair point. If you look at communities around the world, the name of libraries, schools, arts centers, these are culturally relevant and highly visible buildings, and they're exactly the sort of buildings that are named after culturally important people, especially writers. So in Montreal, you'll find the Bibliothèque Mordecai Richler. You'll find the Pierre Burton Library in Woodbridge, Ontario. You'll find the Emily Carr branch of the Great Victoria Public Library. For schools, there's hundreds of schools in Canada named after writers, from the Robert Service School in Dawson City to the Lucy Maud Montgomery School in Charlottetown. And our cultural plan, it talks about how the whole community needs to be involved in the implementation of the cultural plan. We can't leave it just at the district. And the library and our schools are an important part of our community. So I've heard it being said that the library said this about the naming of their buildings, or the school board has said that, but I don't think we've ever seen anything in writing. I don't know if anybody's ever officially asked them about why we can't name a building. So I say, let's ask them. If either board's policy is not to name buildings after people, then let's ask them to explain and rationalize that policy. At the same time, I'd say let's respond to the Arts Council's letter and address their concerns. And I say, and say why we think the Arts and Cultural Center should be named after George Riga. For me personally, the Arts and Cultural Center makes the most sense. And that's largely because of the role George Riga had in trying to establish an arts center in Summerland way back in the 70s. I don't know if everybody knows the story. It goes into detail if anybody's read George Riga's biography by Professor James Hoffman. It's back in 1975, there was a building known as Century House, which was the old hospital. Maybe Councillor Barkwell was born there. Were you? Yeah. So at the time, that building was sitting empty. And Riga led a campaign to convert it into a community arts center. They formed a group, a foundation, who approached the town council. And there was a alderman at the time named Vaughn Willis who encouraged the group to prepare a feasibility study for council, which the group did using an architect and professional consultants. But then when Willis tried to present the report and the recommendations to council, he couldn't find anybody to second his motion to table it. And so it was never discussed. And another member of council at the time then moved that the document be rejected and without any discussion, which it was, and that was passed. And at the very same meeting, council voted to demolish Century House. You know, we've always had lively meetings here in Summerland, I guess, council meetings. So Riga's group applied for a court injunction to halt the demolition, and local artists staged an occupation of the building. Then early one morning, the municipality moved in with a wrecking crane and began battering down the roof, and debris narrowly missing the occupants. There are photographs of an occupier jumping aboard the crane, and there's one photograph of a young Ken Smedley spraying a fire hose at the crane operator. So eventually the town council agreed to leave the building intact pending the litigation. A court ruled in favor of the town council, and in 1978, Century House was demolished. And the community never got its arts center. And to this day, I believe that the lot is still sitting empty. And so here we are today, 46 years later, and we do have an arts center, but you know, that's kind of where it all started. So we did receive an email over the weekend from Janet Peake, the president of the Arts Council, who referred to this particular piece of Summerland history. And she seemed to indicate support for naming the Arts Center after Riga after all, though it's not clear if she was speaking for herself or for the Arts Council.
If I could just interject, yeah. I received an email later today after I had spoken to you, and she said those were her personal opinion, not the board.
Fair enough. So anyway, I would think all three of these organizations should be falling over themselves to want to name their buildings after such a local person of cultural importance. But so that's for that reason I introduce my motion. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great bit of storytelling. Everyone likes that kind of history.
And just to clarify, if I may, my objective isn't to have all three buildings named after him. It's to have one.
Right. Councillor Barkwell.
That was going to be my question, because it sounded like, you know, you're requesting what the request is really just whether they would consider it or something like that, right? Because we don't want all three then. And if it's a request to do something, then they might do it and we end up that way. So we got to be careful with that letter. And I go along with that. I've never ever heard of it being referred to as the Blagborn building. But that's not to say that somewhere deep in some archive, there's some sort of motion, but not in my memory.
Any further discussion on this? Councillor Van Alphen.
Might as well weigh in. In the letter, it says, we understand that this is a district building and that the naming of the building is a decision of the district. So, do you want to name it? Fly at her. Solve it right now.
Personally, I would like, same as Janet Peak. Personally, I would like to see George Riga's name on a building in Summerland, but I'd like to see it specifically on the Arts and Culture Center, because that's, I mean, I know his kids went to school here, and I know that the library has his publications and all of that, but he's so connected to arts and culture in Summerland. It seems to me to be, well, the kind of obvious way to go, and I appreciate Councillor Holmes for bringing this out of correspondence so we could have the opportunity to talk about it. I guess I should take this off. And frankly, I think this is probably the easiest way to go to. It would be really nice to have the name selected before we have our reopening celebration, and the signage can be ordered and that kind of thing. Not that I want to rush it, but it would be nice, and it seems to me personally, it feels very appropriate to name the Arts and Cultural Center after Mr. Riga. Councillor Carlson.
And just a note that the next library board meeting is September 8th, and they're only quarterly, so it would be timely to get it there ideally before that, so it makes an agenda if that's the direction that we do go. Thank you.
Councillor Barkwell.
I like Councillor Van Alphen's suggestion that we just put forward a motion tonight to rename the Arts and Cultural Center the George Riga Arts and Cultural, or Arts Center, or I'm not quite sure the words, the George Riga Arts and Cultural Center, and it's done. And we don't have to send letters to the library and the school board, and we've asked for their input, they gave it. We have other thoughts. I just don't want to interfere with Councillor Holmes' motion, so I'm not quite sure what we should do.
Well, that one's on the floor, so we'll have to decide on that. Okay. And then certainly, well, I guess it's depending on how that goes, then we could entertain a second motion. Is that the way we should proceed? Yes. Okay. So if there's, Councillor Holmes.
Yeah, the reason I guess I put forward the motion that I did was because I don't want us to appear that we're ignoring the Arts Council and that we're not hearing what they're saying, and I just put forward, you know, they did raise that why can't one of these other buildings be named, and I don't have an answer for that, so I was just saying. Let's, you know, so I was just thinking, well, let's get an answer. But as I said, you know, I'm with you. I think it's the Arts and Cultural Center that's the right one. So if, you know, I would certainly support that if that came forward as a motion.
Okay, so, Graham?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just to take off on something you said regarding the signage, it would be actually very helpful to staff tonight if council did decide on a specific name for us to be able to get that signage together. We do still have some time. so that it could be ordered and in place in time for that event. So just sort of underscore that point I think I heard you make.
Councillor Van Elfen, is this to do with the motion that's on the floor now?
Yes, Madam Mayor.
Okay.
We're gonna ask the question then? I'm sorry.
Yeah, yes, I just want to make sure that everybody has said what they would like to say about the motion that's currently on the floor. And not seeing any hands up, I will call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Okay, so that's defeated. And Councillor Holmes, my understanding is that you're okay with that? Good. Okay, so Councillor Van Elfen.
I'd like to put a motion forward then, Madam Mayor, that we name the newly renovated Arts and Cultural Building, the George Riga Arts and Cultural Center.
Seconder, Councillor Holmes. Further discussion on this? All in favor? And none opposed. Carried. Thank you, Councillor Holmes. No committee or commission minutes, so we'll get right on to councillor reports. And I'm going to start with Councillor Traynor.
I don't have anything to report tonight.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Patton.
I will follow my colleague, Councillor Traynor, because I also have nothing to report tonight.
Okay. Third time's a charm, maybe, with Councillor, no. All righty. Councillor Carlson.
I had something and I was thinking about it earlier and I completely forget, so thanks. See you in late September.
Well, hopefully we'll see you before that, and Councillor Holmes.
Thank you. I attended the RDS meeting last week. I haven't had time to write the report yet, but I'll get that out this week. Also, I'd like to thank the mayor for giving the big reminder about the Make Water Works pledge. So we're running neck and neck with Peachland right now. We were slightly ahead earlier today, but Peachland is fighting back. They see that we've closed in on them. So right now we're sitting at 63 votes, keeping in mind that a week ago we only had 4. All right, and Peachland was sitting at 50 all week. They're now at 67. So they obviously Peachland sees what we're doing. That they must think they're out to win this, and I really think that we should make an effort here, because in the since they've been running this campaign, I think it's been 5 years now, I guess. It's Peachland and Armstrong have won it every year, and we can't let that happen. We can't let Peachland win it again. So I really encourage, everyone in Summerland, especially this year, where we're down to stage 2. This is the year that we should really make the effort to win this. It's for the community. It's just bragging rights, but it'd be great bragging rights. So.
Yes, it would. Sorry, Mayor McCourtoff. She was intending to win it this year too, but she's had other challenges, of course, in Osuis. So thank you for reminding us of that, Councillor Holmes. And I need to hit send. I've been sending it to a whole bunch of people I know. Councillor Van Elfen.
Not too much to report, Madam Mayor. The farmers market is alive and well downtown, and the vaccination tent has been there every week. So if you're lacking a vaccination, it's easy to do. It's downtown at the farmers market, Penticton and Summerland. So thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Did you remember? Thank you.
It's just after speaking about George Riga, I forgot that that's what we were talking about all last week at the Riga Fest, and I was fortunate enough to be able to participate on behalf of Mayor Boot at an event at Lunescence Winery put on by the Riga Festival, and Aaron Lowen and his fabulous quartet were able to perform, and it was a really good time. So thank you for letting me have that opportunity. I also participated in one of the online readings, and I enjoyed that very much. So congratulations to the folks at the Riga Festival, and hopefully next year will be bigger and better.
And thank you for filling in for me as I had to leave town. So thank you. Okay, anybody online for the second? No. Okay, so we'll call for adjournment.